In the autumn of 1964, Gordon Mills sat in an office in London and was told that Tom Jones had one more chance. Not in those exact words. The British music industry in 1964 did not always communicate in those exact words, but the meaning was clear. Chills and Fever had been released in August. It had not charted. The record label had signed a young man from Wales on the basis of a manager's conviction, and the conviction had not yet produced the result that conviction needed to produce in order to remain credible. One more single. One more attempt to find what everyone in the room, the manager, the label, and the singer himself, believed was there. Gordon Mills walked out of that office with a deadline and a problem. The deadline was clear. One more single had to work. The problem was also clear. The song did not yet exist. He needed to write it. And he needed to write it, knowing that if it didn't work, the career of the young man from Pontypridd would not continue in this form. The label's patience would end. The manager's credibility would end with it. The voice that Mills had heard in a London club in 1963 and believed in through 2 years of London's indifference would go back to whatever South Wales was willing to offer. That was the weight Gordon Mills carried out of that office. Not the weight of a business setback. The weight of something more difficult. The possibility that a belief you have organized 2 years of your professional life around may not be rewarded in the form you expected it to be. He had heard the voice. He had staked his reputation on it. He had moved a young man and his family from South Wales to London, had gotten them a record deal, had watched the first single go out and return in silence. And now an office in London had given him one more chance to prove that the belief was correct. He was a songwriter. He had one tool available to him that most managers did not. He could write the song himself. Mills went home and started writing. What happened next changed everything. Gordon Mills offered "It's Not Unusual" to Sandie Shaw first. This detail, small, almost incidental, the kind of detail that gets lost in the version of a story that only remembers the ending, matters because of what it reveals about how the song existed before it became the song everyone knows. Sandie Shaw was a 20-year-old English pop singer who had reached #1 in the British charts in 1964 with "Always Something There to Remind Me." She was the right kind of artist for Mills to approach, young, charting, with a sound that was close enough to what the pop market was rewarding to make the pitch sensible. He brought her the song. She listened. She passed. The reasons for her decision belonged to the practical considerations of an active pop career, schedules, the sound she was currently developing, a sense that this particular song wasn't quite right for this particular moment in her career. She passed, and the song came back to Gordon Mills. And Gordon Mills, who had written the song with a voice in mind, who had spent the last 2 years believing in that voice through Chills and Fever, and the label's narrowing patience, and the London music industry's persistent skepticism about a Welsh singer who sounded like this, brought the song to Tom Jones. He brought it to him not as a consolation, not as the second choice, as the song that had always been written for the voice it was now going to. Tom Jones heard it and understood, not in the careful, analytical way of an industry professional evaluating a commercial opportunity. in the way a voice understands a song, immediately, in the body, before the mind has had time to form an opinion. The melody moved in exactly the ranges where his voice did its best work. The arrangement, brass section, the particular rhythmic momentum that Les Reed had built into the chord progression, created exactly the kind of platform that a large voice needed to stand on without disappearing into. This was the song. Both of them knew it. They booked the session at Decca. They brought the brass section. They set the arrangement. The red light came on in the studio, the same studio where Chills and Fever had been recorded 6 months earlier. But a different session now, with a different weight behind it. The deadline from the label's office. The 2 years of London's patience running thin. The song that Sandie Shaw had passed on. The manager who had not given up. All of it was in the room when Tom Jones stood in front of the microphone. He had learned, in the session 6 months before, what the microphone needed from him. He had learned how to translate the working men's club quality, the honesty, the full commitment, the giving the room everything the song required, into something that a studio could hold. Now the song required everything he had learned. He sang. To understand what Gordon Mills was facing in the autumn of 1964, it helps to understand what the British music industry looked like at that moment. The Beatles had released A Hard Day's Night in July. Can't Buy Me Love had been #1 in the spring. The Rolling Stones were charting. The Kinks, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five. The energy of British pop in 1964 was organized almost entirely around guitars and youth and the particular sound that had emerged from London and Liverpool and the working-class club scenes of the North. That sound was not the sound of Tom Jones. Tom Jones sounded like American soul and rhythm and blues, filtered through a Welsh valley, and a voice that was larger than any of the rooms it had performed in. He did not sound like a beat group. He did not sound like a skiffle singer or a mod. He sounded like something older, raw, more physically imposing than the pop market of 1964 was quite ready to standardize around. Gordon Mills had believed from the beginning that this was not a disadvantage. He had believed it because he had watched what happened to rooms when Tom Jones sang in them. He had watched people who came in expecting an ordinary night leave having experienced something they would describe for days afterward. He had watched the voice do what it did to an audience, and he had believed that what audiences did in rooms they would also do in front of radios if they could only hear the thing once. The problem was getting them to hear it once. Chills and Fever had not been the wrong voice. It may have been the wrong song. A voice like Tom Jones's needed a song that matched its scale, not in volume, but in emotional architecture. Something that gave the voice something to do that a smaller voice genuinely couldn't do. Something where the size of the instrument was not a stylistic choice, but a structural requirement. Mills understood this. He had been circling around it for 2 years. Now he had a deadline and a blank page, and the knowledge that the blank page had to become the right song or the thing he had believed in since 1963, would not survive. He sat down with Les Reed, a composer and arranger he trusted. 2 men in a room, a deadline, a voice that needed a song worthy of it. They started writing. The craft of songwriting is not visible in the finished song. When a listener hears "It's Not Unusual," The brass, the tempo, the melody, the particular way the chorus opens. They don't hear the process that produced it. They don't hear the rejected first lines or the chord progressions that didn't quite work, or the moments when one of the two men in the room understood that they needed to try a different direction. They hear the finished thing. But the finished thing was shaped by the pressure that produced it. Songs written under deadline, by people who know exactly what is at stake and exactly what the instrument they're writing for can do. Those songs have a particular quality, a specificity, a sense that every element exists because it needed to, not because it happened to be available. It's Not Unusual was that kind of song. It was written by a manager who had spent 2 years listening to a voice and believing in it, and watching that belief be tested by the indifference of an industry. And it was written by a composer who understood what brass could do to a melody, and what a melody could do to a voice that was big enough to carry it without letting the orchestra swallow it. The song they wrote was not modest. It did not hedge against the size of the voice. It was written directly for the size of the voice, the melody moving in ranges that required something genuine to navigate them. The arrangement building to moments where the voice had to produce something that a smaller instrument simply could not reach. When they finished writing it, Mills looked at what they had and understood that it was right. The question was, who would record it first? It's Not Unusual was released in January 1965. Within 3 weeks, it had reached the top of the British charts. The voice from Pontypridd, the voice that had spent years in working men's clubs across South Wales, that had come to London on a manager's promise, that had recorded a single in the summer of 1964 that went nowhere, that had been given one more chance in an office conversation that autumn, was #1 in the United Kingdom. The silence after Chills and Fever had been answered. Not immediately, not easily, but definitively. Gordon Mills received the news in a way that anyone who has believed in something through years of opposition receives confirmation, not with surprise, because the belief had always included the outcome, but with a particular quality of relief that only comes when the thing you believed turns out to have been real. The label, which had given them one more chance, had received the outcome that one more chances sometimes produce. Tom Jones performed It's Not Unusual on Top of the Pops. On the television programs that reached the households that radio alone couldn't reach. In the venues that opened when a voice had a #1 behind it, rather than a promising manager's conviction. He performed it with the same quality that had held the rooms in South Wales, the same full commitment, the same refusal to give anything less than the song required. But now the rooms were large enough. Now the song was built for the voice rather than the other way around. Now the microphone had already been understood in a previous session, so that the energy could go entirely into the song and not into the learning of how the equipment worked. Everything that had come before, the clubs, the failed single, the office deadline, the song that a different artist had passed on, had led to this. The story of It's Not Unusual is usually told as the beginning. Tom Jones's debut, his breakthrough, the moment a Welsh singer from Pontypridd became an international name. But the story that produced It's Not Unusual started in an office in autumn 1964, when a manager was told that one more chance was all that remained, and chose to use that chance to write the right song instead of finding a more immediate solution. Mills could have brought Tom Jones any song that was available. He could have found something that might chart marginally, that might extend the label's patience a little longer, that might buy time without necessarily producing the breakthrough that both of them had been working toward. He wrote the song instead. He wrote it with the specific knowledge of what the voice could do that 2 years of believing in it had given him. He wrote it under the pressure of a deadline that had no flexibility and a label that had run out of extensions. And he offered it to another artist first, for practical reasons that belonged to the ordinary daily movement of a music career. And when she passed, he brought it to the singer it had always been written for. The one who had been waiting in London since 1963, who had packed what he could carry and left Pontypridd on a manager's promise, who had stood in front of a studio microphone for the first time in the summer of 1964 and learned what the equipment needed from him, who had held on through the silence after chills and fever, through the office meeting that gave them one more chance, through the weeks between the deadline and the song being finished. He had held on, and when the song arrived, written for his voice by the manager who had never stopped believing the voice was worth writing for, he was ready. The records show that It's Not Unusual reached #1 in the United Kingdom in the spring of 1965. What the records don't show is the autumn office in 1964, and the manager who walked out of it with a deadline and wrote the right song anyway. That is where the #1 began.